Hi again. Our next company is Guard Therapeutics, a company working on treatments for kidney injury. With us, we have here today Tobias Agervald, the CEO. Tobias, thank you very much for being here, and now the word is yours.
Thank you very much. So my name is Tobias Agervald. I'm the CEO of Guard Therapeutics, and glad to be here and present our company. And just to give you a sort of 1-minute summary of Guard Therapeutics, our projects where we are today, this is just one introductory slide. So we're a clinical stage biotech company, and as heard, we're developing targeted therapies for patients with different types of acute kidney injuries. We recently transitioned into phase 2, so we're currently running a large global phase 2 study called the Akita study, and I will come to that. That includes 268 patients for the treatment of AKI in conjunction with open chest cardiac surgery. So open chest cardiac surgery, there are multiple reasons we're going into that space. Of course, because we have a good molecule for that specific indication, but also because there's a large unmet need and a significant commercial opportunities. We see a plus $1 billion commercial opportunity in this space with regards to peak sales. And as you also will see, there's a limited competition without any approved therapies. Also in this indication, the recruitment is projected to be relatively quick, at least in comparison to many other types of indications, which means we have data coming through relatively quickly. We have first an interim data analysis expected in the first quarter of 2023, and we have top-line results expected towards the end of next year. I will not discuss preclinical data today, but we have validated our lead asset called RMC-035, also referred to as Rosgard, in multiple different disease models. And we think this is important because it increases our confidence that also the nice preclinical results we have will translate into similar effects in humans. We also know there's a well-defined regulatory pathway for approval in cardiac surgery AKI in the US, which is a main market, and this also facilitates, of course, the design of the clinical development program. So I think overall what I want to show you is that we think we have a robust project and a clear value proposition going forward in development here. And I should also mention we're a listed company on the Nasdaq First North Growth Markets. So jumping straight into AKI or acute kidney injury. This is a very severe disease, and as heard, there are no approved therapies in this space. And actually, AKI is exactly what it sounds like. It's an acute injury of the kidneys, which leads to a dramatic and immediate decline in the renal function or the kidney function. This is often seen in critically ill patients, so there's not one sort of patient category, but for example, in the intensive care unit, there are patients following major surgeries. We have patients that have severe infections, for example, that can develop acute kidney injuries. But overall, there's a large unmet medical need. We have about 13 million individuals per year being affected. And again, AKI is associated with very high morbidity as well as mortality. And in the severe cases, these patients, they need dialysis treatment. And many patients also progress to something called chronic kidney disease, which means that they never experience any kind of recovery, but they actually have a permanently impaired and reduced kidney function. So this is exactly the space where we're going to want to go into. And to further visualize the therapeutic opportunity in AKI, we made this graph. So on the y-axis, you see kidney function, and the x-axis, there's a time component. So just walking through this, if you look at the gray line, this exemplifies a healthy subject that goes into a stage of AKI or an acute kidney injury, but actually has a natural sort of recovery without any kind of treatment. And obviously, that's not something we would like to treat or target. By contrast, on the opposite side of this, we have this orange line where you have patients that have a severe acute kidney injury that rapidly progresses all the way down to essentially complete loss of kidney function, which means that they need dialysis treatment and or even a kidney transplantation subsequently. But we also have intermediate variants of these. For example, healthy individuals that I mentioned transition to chronic kidney disease, they partially recover, but also patients with pre-existing chronic kidney disease that have an accelerated loss of kidney function, eventually progressing more rapidly into dialysis or need for transplantation. And this is exactly the therapeutic target we have for our lead asset, RMC-035, as we'll come to. So looking specifically into cardiac surgery, we know there's about 1 million patients still undergoing open chest surgeries due to what we call a bypassed graft surgeries due to ischemic heart disease. And this is often performed in conjunction with heart wall replacement. Only in the US and EU, there's approximately 500,000 surgeries being performed each year. So this is a very big patient population, obviously. What is less known is that AKI is actually very common and severe consequence, sort of a collateral damage of the cardiac surgery, where the overall estimated AKI rate is about, well, 10 to 30%, depending on the definitions you use. But if you look in enriched patient populations, for example, individuals with a high degree of risk factors, we expect an event rate of more than 50% in these patients. So our solution to this is RMC-035. This is a first-in-class drug targeting acute kidney injuries, not only cardiac surgery, although we've chosen cardiac surgery for the primary development program. So RMC-035, it's something we've made a endogenous protein based on a protein called alpha-1 microglobulin, or A1M. But we made some certain modifications to that so it becomes druggable. We produce that recombinantly, and we also have a patent protection for that. And the brilliance of this molecule is that we actually have retained function of the native A1M protein, which is essentially by nature geared towards protection against acute kidney injuries. But we have improved properties, for example, solubility. That's important when you do drug development. So I've listed the key elements here, or the functions of RMC-035, and also importantly, all these individual functions have been very nicely attributed to different parts. To the right, you see the figure, which is a three-dimensional crude structure of the molecule, and we can pinpoint specific parts of the molecule that actually possess these specific functions. So first, we have a free radical scavenging, which means that we essentially block the surge of free radicals or toxic elements that are being produced when the kidneys undergo ischemic periods during cardiac surgery. There's also a tissue deficit of something called reductase capacity, which also counteracts the generation of free radicals. And this is also another element of the molecule that we're adding to this. The third component is heme binding, because we know in cardiac surgery there's a high degree of hemolysis, which means that the red blood cells are being destructed in the heart-lung machine. And then that leads to release of a substance called heme, that goes into the kidney and is a directly kidney toxic. And this is also something we block with this molecule. And finally, during ischemic period of cardiac surgery, we know that something called the mitochondria, which produces the energy within the cells, are essentially suffering, and ultimately that leads to cell death. And this molecule, RMC-035, can also improve and stabilize the mitochondria during this surgical stress and prevent the cell death. We also think the molecule is ideal for AKI treatment. As I've shown you, we really have appropriate mechanisms that targets the major disease pathways of AKI. But equally important, we have a renal biodistribution, which means that the molecule is actually being very selectively taken up by kidney cells and proximal tubular kidney cells, which is the main site of injury. So essentially, we get the compound exactly in the cells which we want to protect. There's also short systemic half-life, so the exposure in plasma goes down very quickly. And this compound is given by IV administration, so it's suitable for in-hospital treatment. And it's a really short treatment duration. I will show you that in the phase 2 design. So essentially, we treat in the phase 2 for 3 days. So moving on to the clinical studies of RMC-035. So we so far conducted and completed 4 separate studies, ROSO-1 to ROSO-4. The first 2 studies are conducted in healthy subjects. This is our pretty standardized clinical trials where you do single ascending dose and multiple ascending dose to just evaluate the PK, the safety and tolerability of the compound in healthy subjects. The ROSO-3 study was done specifically in patients with various degrees of renal impairment, mainly to elucidate the pharmacokinetics, essentially how the molecule is being eliminated and how blood concentrations of the molecule look like in different stages of chronic kidney disease. And Rostov-4 study was the first sort of minimal POC study we did. We call this as a phase 1b study, but that was done in the target patient populations, that is, patients undergoing open chest cardiac surgery. Without going into great details, we conclude on the premise of these 4 studies that RMC-035 is safe and well tolerated. We've exposed so far 52 subjects in these 4 phase 1 studies, mostly healthy volunteers, but we also had 8 subjects with renal impairment and 8 subjects undergoing cardiac surgery. And we didn't really pick up any safety signals, and it was generally well tolerated across these study populations. We have no serious adverse events attributable to study drug. And again, the PK profile of the compound demonstrates a rapid initial elimination from plasma. And we see that the exposure, though, is inversely correlated to kidney function. That means we have to reduce the dose when we give this to patients with impaired kidney function. And this is also very important when we set the dose now in the phase 2 Akita study. Despite being a PK safety study, we also did an exploratory analysis of some biomarkers, and very nicely, this is indicative of a reduced tubular cell injury with RMC-035 treatment, and I will just visualize that. So essentially what we did is that we collected urine biomarkers that reflects cell injury in the kidney just before the surgery and just immediately after the surgery, 4 hours after the onset of surgery. And we measured a series of different biomarkers showing the same pattern. These are 2 examples, biomarkers called LFA-PB and NGAL. They are commonly used and validated biomarkers for acute kidney injury. And as expected, if you look at the baseline, that is pre-surgery, we can't really measure anything of these biomarkers because they are injury biomarkers and there are no concrete injury before the surgery. But again, as expected, once the patients undergo surgery, there's a spike. There's a really dramatic increase in these biomarkers. You see the black here in the placebo group. There's a quite significant and strong increase in these biomarkers. But this appears to be blunted with RMC-035 treatment. As you can see, the sample size is very limited. We have 8 subjects on active. We have 4 subjects on placebo. So this is clearly underpowered to really see statistically significant differences. But nevertheless, this is a very important signal, fully consistent also what we see in the non-clinical data that we have. So I think taken together, this really provides a solid basis for us now moving forward into phase 2. So today I will present a little bit about the ongoing phase 2 study, which we also call the Akita study. We thought this was an appropriate name. It's named after a Japanese guard dog, appropriate for Guard Therapeutics. And we also capture the AKI acronym of acute kidney injury. So this is a phase 2 study to evaluate the efficacy and safety of RMC-035 in patients with undergoing open chest cardiac surgery and additional risk factors for developing acute kidney injury. So this is a global multi-center study conducted both in Europe and in North America. As we will come to, it's a randomized study, placebo-controlled, it's double-blind, and it's a parallel treatment design. We plan to include 268 subjects in a 1-to-1 randomization, active versus placebo. There's a short treatment period of 3 days with a post-operative follow-up, including day 30 and 90 after surgery. And this design, it's a large phase 2 study, we're aware of that. So this will be a very important design to actually inform us about the best possible outcome or the best possible design of phase 3 and also facilitate regulatory interaction when we design on an appropriate phase 3 design. And just to give you a visualization of this, we have a screening period up to 30 days before the surgery when we get informed consent of the subjects that participate in the study. And then we have essentially a treatment period for 3 days. This mostly occurs in the ICU ward or potentially once the patients are transferred from the ICU to regular ward, but still during the hospitalization period. And the treatment ends at day 3, so we give in total 5 doses, the first dose being given during surgery, and then we give repeat doses up to 48 hours after the surgery. And the primary endpoint assessment is 72 hours after surgery. So really the primary endpoint is being assessed very close to the treatment period. So there's not a long follow-up time until we can actually have results and inform about the outcome of the primary endpoint. Once the patients are discharged, we bring them back to the hospital at day 30 and also day 90, where we evaluate, most importantly, their kidney function to also follow the trajectory of the kidney function after surgery once being stabilized. And there are multiple different types of endpoints that one could use, and this is also very important design discussions we've had. The primary endpoint we use in the AKITA study is actually, it's a binary outcome of either the patients have AKI or they don't. And we use the definition from KDIGO, which is essentially the International Society of Nephrology, that has very strict and formal guidelines of what AKI means. And we assess the presence or absence of AKI within the first 72 hours after surgery. But of course, we can look at changes in kidney function in many different ways. So we have key secondary endpoints, which include that we look at the time-corrected area under the curve of the kidney function, including the plasma biomarkers we use to assess kidney function. We look not only at the presence of AKI, but also the severity, the duration, and the persistence of AKI, because, of course, you could have mild AKI or you could have very severe AKI, and those are completely different sort of clinical manifestations. We look specifically at the presence or incidence of dialysis treatment and a composite endpoint called MAKE, standing for Major Adverse Kidney Events. And this is a composite of either death, dialysis, or more or equal to 25% decline in kidney function as compared to the level they had prior going into surgery. We will do a blinded interim analysis when we randomized and treated 134 patients. That is exactly 50% of the anticipated recruitment. And we expect to get data from this blinded interim analysis the first quarter in 2023. And this will be conducted by an independent data monitoring committee. And in essence, the principal outcomes of this analysis will be based on pre-specified criteria. So either we continue as planned up to 268 subjects. We have the option to expand the sample size up to 348 subjects based on certain conditions. But of course, there's also an element of futility and safety analysis. So if we really see that there's no effect at all, or if there would be a safety concern, the study can be prematurely terminated. But these are the major sort of outcomes. When designing the AKITA study, I just want to recognize that we really have world-leading experts in this space. To the left, we have 3 European experts. We have Professor Alexander Sabok in Münster, who's also the lead investigator of the AKITA trial, who's an anesthesiologist. We have Professor Andreas Böning in Gießen in Germany, who's a cardiovascular and cardiothoracic surgeon. And we have Professor Claudio Ronco, who's an Italian nephrologist. And in the US, we have representation by Daniel Engelman at Bay State, Massachusetts, and who's also a cardiovascular surgeon. And we have Professor Jane Coyner in Chicago. So we really have a good representation of all the different sort of specialties that are being involved and interested in AKI and also in the clinical management of these patients. Just a couple of words on the commercial opportunity. Of course, there's different ways to estimate, to assess this. In a simple way, we could say we just look at what's the overall patient population undergoing cardiac surgery in EU and the Big Five in Europe. That's about 500,000. And based on the enrichment of higher risk individuals in the AKITA trial and also in the envisioned phase 3 trial, we think that there's around 200 patients that would be eligible and would be the initial addressable patient population in a commercial setting. So depending on the estimates, of course, we have different price ranges, and that also depends, of course, depending on the outcome of your phase 3 and also the endpoint selection in phase 3. But you end up in peak sales up to $2 billion. So I think no matter how you look at this, there's really a substantial and significant commercial opportunity. Of course, before going into a big study like AKITA, we need to make sure we have a solid IP position. So we have composition of matter patents covering both RMC-035 and related variants. And that has already been obtained in all the major markets, EU, US, and Japan, which expire in 2037. So that gives us a solid patent protection, also with the possibility for patent extension. We also have a few additional medical use patents with variable expiry from 2029 to 36. And we also have priority patents in our portfolio related to the discovery platform that I won't discuss specifically today. We also get the question about competitors. So this is a very interesting space, I would say. We see emerging competitors, companies investing in this, mainly biotech, but also big pharmas now going into AKI and cardiac surgery AKI. But as said, there is no approved drugs, and I think we're advanced. There are no really companies that are in phase 3, that as far as we know. And this is just a way to kind of list these companies, the mode of actions of the compound, which are different than RMC-035, and also the different modalities or the disease pathways that we think is important. So, for example, the multi-target approach, the ischemic injury, mitochondrial binding stabilization. We have the heme binding component, the free radical component, kidney being the primary target organ for the treatment and supporting of tissue generation. And I think in essence what we see here is that we really click all these boxes, and I think that also makes sense based on the mechanisms that we have. And we have pretty high confidence that RMC-035 is definitely the first in class and could also be the first to market in this space. And as a final word, we're expanding our pipeline opportunities. We are looking actively now, not only in cardiac surgery, but this is a suitable molecule also for other types of AKI indications like kidney transplantation and sepsis. We're looking very concretely into kidney transplantation right now to potentially expand the program. And we have more assets now coming through our discovery pipeline, which is also suitable for renal diseases, but also other non-renal diseases. So rounding off, these are the key milestones we can expect during 2022 and also in the upcoming year. We expect to be able to submit applications for an IND opening and also fast-track designation in the US in the second half of this year. We have, as alluded to, the interim analysis of the Akita study coming up with top-line results towards the end of next year. We're, as I said, actively looking into start of a clinical program in kidney transplantation, and obviously that's something we will get back to in more detail. And similarly, we have now promising preclinical data of new molecules coming through with very nice efficacy also in for example, various types of AKI models. So we expect candidate nomination and even to bring additional assets forward to make them phase 1 ready. So a lot of significant value inflection points on the way. So with that, I hope I've given you a good overview of Guard Therapeutics, where we are in the project, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tobias, for such a nice presentation. And now we have time for a couple of questions. And my first question will be around your primary endpoints, primary endpoint on Akita and your secondary endpoints. Because you have said that your primary endpoint is a binary outcome. Either you have or you don't have acute kidney injury. But your secondary endpoints are also very relevant. For example, severity. In a hypothetical case that you would not see a significant difference in your primary endpoint, but you see in the secondary endpoint, for example, severity, would that be enough in order to move clinical development forward? Or one doesn't make sense without the other? So
that is a very, very good point. And we call the Akita study an exploratory phase 2 study because, as you say, in a clinical study, you have to pinpoint, you have to select one primary endpoint. And there was a lot of discussions around this when we finally ended up with the binary primary endpoint. The benefit of having that is it gives us very nice power, actually. So we're very well powered for looking at all the secondary endpoints. But you're completely right, and I think that's a point I've also tried to make earlier, that you could still fail on the primary endpoint because it's a binary outcome if you have nice effect and you can visualize a renal protective effect. So I think if we see consistency across several secondary endpoints, even if you would fail on the primary, that itself could be very relevant, clinically relevant, sufficient, and would also put us in a good position to have an informed discussion with regulators, how we would set up a pivotal program in this space.
Very, very interesting. And my final question is, after Akita, it's still far from today, it's 2023, but what's your strategy to move forward to a potential phase 3? Is it you would like to do it alone, or you're planning to do it with a partner? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I think it always at this stage, you have to keep all the options open, of course. I think if you have a new, potentially first-in-class drug, first-to-market drug, with nice clinical data in a large phase 2 study, I think the most reasonable option would actually be moving forward with a partner on board. And I think if that becomes the outcome of the Akita study, I think we're in a very good position to move forward in the best possible way.
Okay, interesting. Thank you. Tobias, thank you very much for being here with us today and for your nice presentation.
Thank you.